Of all the weapons created in the history of time, by far the most popular, not only with bears, but also with humans, has been the sword. There's a reason that swords are associated with bravery and knights and the ability to poke things. Now, it might not be as fun as something like the chicken bazooka, but when it comes to selling toys as role-play items, nothing beats the sword. I mean, period. You can sell pirate guns and laser guns and all sorts of magic wielding, staff shooting, blasting things, but swords absolutely just capture the imagination of children because, well, let's be honest, it's a giant metaphor for a phallus and the ability to obstruct what's in front of you, and that's a very Freudian concept of childhood identity. It's why you see brands that don't even have swords getting swords. Maybe they're not officially licensed, but children absolutely are drawn to the ability of a sword to use as roleplay. And I made a video quite a while back about how He-Man's power sword worked, and I made the claim that it was the most recognizable, well-known fantasy sword in the world. And of course, when you say something like this on the internet, especially on YouTube, well, it opens up the floodgates that is known as the comment section. Now, I will say for the most part, I'm going to go like 99%, the people on the comment section on this channel are amazing and fantastic and so positive, and I can't even tell you how appreciative I am of everyone who leaves comments. I try to read every one and respond to as many as possible. But to this day, I still get comments about this video and my claim that He-Man's sword is more well-known than any other fantasy sword. Specifically, people constantly bring up that fantasy swords are instantly recognizable no matter what. The thing is, while you may get it when Inigo Montoya is holding that sword, or, well, okay, a lightsaber is different, but lightsabers don't count. I made that clear in the video. I talked about how we're talking about metal swords here, not laser swords. So the real big elephant in the room, if you will, is Excalibur. And everyone constantly writes back to this day, well, what about Excalibur, when I claimed He-Man's sword is more recognizable? Now, while Excalibur has been many things to many people, from a marketing agency to a roadster car, well, the thing is, it is part of pop culture. There's a reason there's a hotel named after it, and apparently America's best dehydrated fruit is known as Excalibur. Hey, who knew? And while movies have made the sword larger than life, there is one aspect of it in particular that makes it so you cannot compare it to a sword like He-Man's power sword. And that's the fact that there is no visual. I mean, this sword has been called Excalibur. It was pulled out of a bog by an 8-year-old girl, and, National Geographic went crazy. But whatever reference, canon, movie, book, comic, story you're looking at, there really isn't any consistency in what Excalibur looks like. I mean, often it is shown with a circular sun, if you will, in the hilt at the very bottom, but in no way is that standard, or is there any kind of brand style guide? And there are plenty of versions of it that don't have, if you will, that sun sphere at the end, and the pommel and the other aspects of the hilt. Vague descriptions in the original, nothing concrete. So how do you translate that? On the other hand, He-Man's sword has the advantage of a very, very distinct look, and I'm talking about those two sort of mini connectors on the top and bottom, or on the left and right. That's an element that you just don't see in any other sword. And the fact that He-Man's sword had to be front and center, like this image right here, for him to use his powers. So you were constantly thrusting the silhouette of the sword right into the viewer's face. And that right there is key, because we're used to seeing this sword from this particular angle, if you will, the flat side of the sword forward. And that is one of the reasons it's so recognizable. Most swords, when you see it in fantasy, science fiction, but we're really going more fantasy here because we're not doing laser swords, sorry Luke, but usually you can't recognize them without some other element, such as, a label saying whose it is. If you didn't know these were G.I. Joe swords, well, you need those labels of Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow to tell you. And a lot of commenters also brought up the Master Sword from Legend of Zelda. But the thing is, again, while it does have the Triforce logo on it, to most people, average people out there, they don't know what the Triforce logo is. I mean, I love Zelda. I'm a huge fan of the series. I've spent hours and hours playing different, iterations. My daughter loves the 8-bit one with me. But most fantasy swords are like the Master Sword, or like Narsil, or I think I incorrectly called it Flame of the West in the previous video, but that's not important. Sting, another great example. You recognize it because it's lit up. Without the energy burst, it's just a plain fantasy sword. And that's the whole thing. Did I say Narsil or Andril? Oh, God, I can't even remember. It was the shards of Narsil, and he made Andril. No, never mind. I'm going to stop trying to correct myself. I probably should just go back and rewatch the video. I do know my swords, I swear, or at least most of them. Point being is, without a wielder, it's hard to recognize whose sword that is. Here's three of the most famous fantasy swords, right? You got Link, you got Conan, and you got He-Man. And again, you'll notice with He-Man's sword, you've got that very distinct look to, I guess you could say, the sides of the blade, with that very thin area connecting it to the pommel. Whereas both Conan and Link's swords really do just look like generic fantasy swords. And we're also, not used to seeing the silhouette in that sense. Sometimes we get that in still images like this, but for the most part, Link's sword on screen in the video game is just sort of a quick slash. You're not really seeing the details. Conan's sword, while it's got, huge heritage, explained both in the original novel and in the movie, and Lion-O, you might say, that comes up all the time. But again, you need the wielder in order to recognize this. Conan needs his sword. Then you're like, oh, it's Conan's sword. Lion-O needs to pick this up. Oh, it's Lion-O's sword. Look what happens when you remove the Thundercats logo from the hilt. See? The sword is no longer recognizable as a Sword of Omens. It requires a logo to be able to tell that. Hence, a wielder. You put it in someone else's hands. He-Man's sword not only has all of these elements, but it's the source of his power. Not as much as King Arthur saying, that makes him king of all England because the Lady of the Lake clamoring in, Samite rose from the water and blah, blah, blah. But because He-Man is that core child becomes powerful adult fantasy. It's the Shazam fantasy, more or less. And in the case of Shazam, or Captain Marvel, you yell out a word and you change. For He-Man, it's using a sword. The sword is the conduit. Going back again to Excalibur, to bring this full circle, not only are you dealing with the lack of a consistent visual to say, oh, that's Excalibur, for, if you will, mainstream public to be aware of what the sword looks like. I'm not talking about those of us who attend San Diego Comic-Con. I'm talking about walking up to someone in the street, holding up a piece of paper, shall we say, that's got a bunch of fantasy swords and saying, identify these swords, Mr. John Q. Public, or Jane Q. Public, or whatever person you're talking to. With Excalibur, to truly recognize it, it needs to be in context. Like Lion-O, like Link. You put a king holding a sword, and that king automatically becomes King Arthur. It doesn't even have to be King Arthur, but I guarantee you, if you show a medieval king in a fantasy setting and give them a sword, case in point, King Randor from Masters of the Universe, there's a reason that his action figure came with a staff, or a spear. Not just because the tooling was available, there were plenty of sword tools available, but because it showed he was King Randor, not King Arthur. The moment you put a sword in his hand and you show this picture, again, to Jane Q. Public or John Q. whatchamacallit, they might say, oh, that's King Arthur, because they see the king elements and the sword. With He-Man's sword, you stick that in the hand of someone else who's not He-Man, and instantly it's like, oh, that's not, Super Deadpool sword guy. Deadpool's holding He-Man's sword. You can't say that with the Master Sword from Zelda. You can't say that with Excalibur. If you put Excalibur, quote-unquote, in Deadpool's hand, no one would say, oh, that's Deadpool holding Excalibur. And that is why He-Man's sword is the most recognizable and, shall I say, best fantasy sword. Let me know what you think. Am I just digging myself a hole having a video about comments I'm receiving on a video that's like a year and a half old? Who knows? I guess we're down that rabbit hole. I look forward to hearing what you have to say about this one. I'll see you in the comment section. And maybe there'll be a video responding to your comment too.